I didn't in Oppos. T moved to the high desert of Nevada, looking for a fight. I just wanted a place where the wind didn't in Oppos. T smelled like exhaust, and the only neighbor I had to worry about was a stray coyote or a stubborn cactus. I spent 20 years as a field investigator for the Department of the Interior, mostly digging through land titles and mineral rights. Essentially a professional paper shifter who knew how to spot a forged signature from 30 paces. It was a life of beige offices and dusty archives, so when I cashed out my pension at 45, I bought 15 acres of sun-baked dirt and scrub brush just outside a town called Willow Creek. The property was perfect, an old limestone ranch house with walls thick enough to survive a siege and a detached garage where I could finally restore my grandfather in Oppos. That's 1969 Chevy Nova. It sat right on the edge of a pristine, gated development called the Pinnacles, a sea of identical sand-colored houses and manicured lawns that looked like they'd been vacuum-sealed in plastic. I made sure of one thing before I signed that deed. I checked the county plat maps 3 times to ensure my dirt was strictly private, unincorporated land, because I'd spent 2 decades seeing what happens when people with too much time and a little bit of authority get together in a committee. The first month was heaven, just me, the desert heat, and the silence of a wrench turning in the garage. But then the envelope arrived. It wasn't Oppos, T in the mailbox. It was taped to my gate, a heavy, cream-colored piece of stationery with a gold emboss seal that looked way too official for a neighborhood social club. It was quote, notice of mandatory annexation, end quote, from the Pinnacles Homeowners Association, signed by a woman named Beatrice Sterling, the president of the board. The letter claimed that due to a new, end quote, community beautification ordinance, end quote, my property was now considered a, end quote, contiguous interest zone, end quote, and I had 30 days to bring my, end quote, unauthorized structure, end quote, my garage, into architectural compliance, pay a $6,000 initiation fee, and stop, end quote, storing vintage scrap metal, end quote, in public view. I stood there in the dust, looking at my Nova, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked on the dry air, because, end quote, contiguous interest zone, end quote, I sent an Oppos, a legal term. It's a word someone makes up when they want to sound like a judge, but they've only ever watched daytime television. I figured it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error from a board retiree. So I wrote a very polite, very firm letter back, explaining that my property was private, my taxes went to the county, and their authority stopped exactly at the asphalt of their gated road. 2 days later, I was under the Nova, covered in grease, and listening to some old blues when the music was cut short by the heavy, rhythmic thud of someone pounding on my garage door. I rolled out on my creeper and looked up to see a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of a very expensive, very angry piece of driftwood. Beatrice Sterling in the flesh. She didn't in Oppos. T say hello. She didn't in Oppos. T introduce herself. She just gestured at my workshop with a manicured finger and told me that my, end quote, defiance, end quote, was costing the community its property value and that the sheriff would be here by sunset if I didn't end Oppos. T signed the integration papers. I wiped my hands on a rag, looked her dead in the eye, and told her that if she didn't end Oppos, T stepped back across the property line, I'd be the one calling the sheriff for trespassing. She didn't end Oppos. T scream. She didn't end Oppos. T throw a tantrum. She just gave me this thin, chilling smile, the kind of smile a predator give a meal it knows it in Oppos. It's already caught, and she whispered that I should enjoy my, end quote, little hobby, end quote, while I still had a roof to keep it under. That was the spark, and for the next 3 months, Beatrice turned my life into a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. The police started showing up every other day, usually around dinner time when I was sitting on the porch with my wife, Sarah, and our teenage son, Leo. It was always the same routine. A noise complaint for, end quote, industrial grinding, end quote. At noon, a report of, end quote, illegal chemical dumping, end quote, when I was just washing my truck, or a, end quote, wellness check, end quote, because someone claimed they heard screaming. The local deputies knew me by name after the 3rd week, and they were as exhausted as I was, apologizing every time they stepped out of the cruiser, but they had to follow up on every call. It was a war of attrition, designed to make my existence so loud and so stressful that I'd just give up and move, but Beatrice didn't end Oppos. T realized that I'd spent 20 years investigating people much smarter and much more dangerous than her. The turning point came on a Tuesday when a social worker showed up at our door, looking nervous and clutching a clipboard, telling us there had been an anonymous report of, in quote, unsafe living conditions, in quote, for a minor. Seeing the look on Leo's face, that confusion and fear that his home was and oppos. T's safe anymore. Something inside me went cold and sharp. That was the day I stopped being a retiree and started being an investigator again. I didn't oppose. T shout, I didn't oppose. T go to the HOA meetings to plead my case. I just went into my office, pulled out my old laptop, and started digging into the one thing HOAs can never truly hide, the money. I spent a week submerged in public records, tax filings, and the HOA's own digital newsletters, which were surprisingly easy to bypass if you knew how to look at the metadata. That's when I found the, end quote, Oasis project, end quote. It was a proposed luxury expansion for the Pinnacles, a private park and underground utility corridor that was supposed to be the, end quote, jewel, end quote, of the community. There was just one problem. The proposed map showed the utility lines running directly through the center of my acreage. If the HOA didn't and oppose, T get my land, the developers couldn't and oppose, T get the permits, and if they didn't and oppose, T get the permits, a very large, end quote, facilitation fee, end quote, promised to the board members would vanish in a thin air. I found a hidden PDF on their server, a contract with a developer named Vantage Crest, which showed that Beatrice had already accepted a, end quote, consultation retainer, end quote, of $80,000, a payment that was contingent on her securing the easement through my property by the end of the fiscal quarter. She wasn't oppos. T, just a bully. She was a broker, and she had sold my land before she even owned it. But Beatrice was getting desperate as her deadline approached, and she started making the kind of sloppy mistakes that get people sent to prison. One night, around 2 a.m, my motion sensors went off, but the cameras showed nothing but static. Someone had used a signal jammer. I didn't oppose. T called the cops. I just grabbed my night vision goggles and slipped out the back door, staying in the shadows of the limestone rocks. I saw 2 figures near my workshop, moving with the clumsy urgency of people who wearin and oppos, T used to the dark. It was Beatrice's husband, Arthur, and a younger guy I recognized as the neighborhood's, end quote, compliance officer, end quote. They were dragging heavy, rusted metal drums into my yard, positioning them right near my wellhead. They were planting evidence of toxic waste, end quote, crime, end quote, that would allow the county to seize the land under environmental emergency laws. I let them finish, I let them drive away, and then I walked out and retrieved the 3 hidden trail cameras I'd buried in the brush weeks ago. Old school, hardwired units that didn't and oppose, T care about signal jammers. I had them in high definition, faces clear, license plates visible, doing exactly what they thought would ruin me. The next morning, the, end quote, environmental protection, end quote, tip came in right on schedule. But instead of the county inspector, I had a detective from the State Bureau of Investigation sitting in my kitchen. I'd called in a few old favors from my interior days, and when the inspector showed up to find, end quote, hazardous waste, end quote, we were waiting for him. But the real kicker was the arson. 2 nights later, a fire broke out in my brush, a fast-moving blaze that nearly reached Sarah's garden before I smothered it with the tractor. My thermal cameras caught the culprit, Beatrice's nephew, a kid she'd hired to, end quote, clean up, end quote, the area. He'd dropped the lighter with his own initials on it, a gift Beatrice had given him for graduation. It was almost poetic how her own vanity was becoming her undoing. The final act happened at the monthly HOA, end quote, Grand Gala, end quote, a black tie event held at the community clubhouse where Beatrice was supposed to announce the, end quote, successful acquisition, end quote, of the new parklands. I didn't oppose. T show up with a lawyer. I showed up with a projector and a thumb drive. I walked into that room, past the stunned caterers and the neighbors who had been whispering about me for months, and I didn't oppose. T say a word to Beatrice. I just plugged into the house system and hit play. The room went silent as the 80-inch screen showed Arthur and the compliance officer dragging barrels in the moonlight, followed by the thermal footage of the arson, and finally, a scanned copy of the $80,000 check Beatrice had cashed into a private offshore account. Beatrice stood there, her glass of champagne trembling so hard the liquid was slopping over the rim, her face turning a shade of gray that matched the limestone of my house. She tried to scream that it was a deep fake, that I was a criminal, but the state troopers walking through the back door cut her short. They didn't in oppos. T just arrest her for the fraud. They took her for conspiracy to commit arson and environmental endangerment. As they let her out in her evening gown, cuffed and sobbing, she looked at me with this raw, unfiltered hatred, and I just lifted my glass of water, the same water she tried to poison, and gave her a silent nod. The fallout was spectacular. The board was dissolved, the end quote, Oasis project end quote, was scrapped, and the HOA was hit with a class action lawsuit from the residents whose dues had been funneled into Beatrice's legal defense fund. My wife got her peace back, Leo got to feel safe in his own room, and I went back to my Nova, but things aren't in oppos. T exactly the same. I kept the steel post I'd built for my gate, but now it doesn't in oppos. T hold A in quote, no trespassing in quote sign. It holds a small laser-etched plaque that says in quote, the investigator is always in, end quote, a little reminder to anyone else who thinks a gated community gives them the right to own their neighbors. It's been a year, and sometimes I see the new HOA board members driving by, and they don an oppos. T look at my house with anger anymore. They look at it with a kind of nervous respect, like they're passing a sleeping dragon they've agreed not to poke. But it makes me wonder how many people are sitting in their homes right now, watching a shadow move across their lawn, wondering if they have the strength to fight back? Justice ISN and oppos. T something that just happens because you're right. It's something you have to build piece by piece until it's strong enough to hold up the world. So, tell me, if you were in my shoes, if someone tried to take the very dirt under your feet, how far would you go to protect it? Would you wait for the law, or would you become the law? Drop a comment below. I want to know if I'm the only one who thinks that sometimes the only way to get peace is to be the one who's better at war.